Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this teaching and learning seminar on developing students' writing skills in undergraduate education. Professor Mara Malagodi, Professors Malagodi, Stephen Gallagher, and I will each speak briefly about how we've tried to develop students' writing skills in our teaching practices. We'll go straight through the three presentations rather than pausing after each one for questions, but there'll be 15 minutes for Q&A at the end of the session. If you have questions, could you send them to me using the chat function, and I'll pose those questions to the panel. The first presentation is by Professor Mara Malagodi. So Mara is an assistant professor here at CUHK Law. She's a comparative constitutional lawyer, and amongst her many other achievements is an award-winning documentary filmmaker. So over to you, Mara.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction. Can you all see my PowerPoint? Let me just. All right, so what I would like to do today very briefly is to share some of the insights that I've gathered in the last 3 years teaching the JD course in legal research, analysis, and writing. So I'll be quite brief, and I hope we can have a good discussion. So that's usually my pitch to the students with respect to my course. As lawyers, words are what we do. And then if I'm feeling a bit venal, I comment that that's also what we get paid for. And the first element in terms of words is the written word. So what I do in the class is to deal with four specific forms of legal writing. It's for first year students who've not studied law before. They all have previous undergrads in other disciplines. So they, of course, have a degree of experience with academic writing. And the question then becomes to kind of channel the writing that they do and that they're used to, and kind of retrain them with respect to the law. So the four forms that I've chosen to deal with in the class are writing a legal essay, and that is also something that I've discussed with colleagues, saying that they would want the students perhaps to have some more specific training with respect to that. And that's similarly to problem questions. So we do a little bit with Iraq and so on in more general terms. And then the idea is to have, so those are the two forms of legal writing which are more centered in terms of law school work, so kind of academic, legal academia, so to speak. And then we have, we focus on two other forms, a legal memorandum that of course is particularly beneficial to students who want to enter legal practice as a solicitor. And that's also what the exam, the format of the exam for my course is. And then we have case notes. So the idea for me is that what I want the students to be able to achieve once they approach perhaps their summer vacation schemes, their internships, is that if they're given an assignment in a law firm, they have a sense of what's expected with a legal memo. And then I have the final one is a case note. And the case note I find interesting because it's one of those forms of legal writing that straddles both legal academia and professional practice, in the sense that, for instance, I give students to look at different samples, some case notes from academic journals, and some case notes which are published on law firms, barrister chambers website. So something that practicing lawyers end up writing as well, perhaps with respect to some important cases they've litigated, or some cases which are important in their line of practice. So also with the case notes and the legal essay, it's with the view of building their CV. So with legal essays, we do quite a lot in terms of legal essay competitions. And I'm going to talk about those in a moment and how I use some samples from the Law Reform Commission essay competitions. And the case notes, I think, are also a easier way to get published at the beginning. So perhaps to build the student CV in a way that helps their career prospect. So those are the 4 forms that I deal with in the class. Let me just say something about the structure of the course. And of course, the JD course, as everyone here knows, has a very big number of students. I usually have over 200 of them. I'm convening the class, and I am being helped in the last 2 years by a number of tutors. So we have a different structure compared to other JD courses. Out of 13 weeks, 4 of the weeks are split. They have an hour-and-a-half lecture with me, and then they have in smaller groups sessions with the tutors who come from practice. They're all barristers. They are CUHK alumni, and they have to write for. So the students have to prepare a draft of a legal essay, of a problem question, of a legal memo, of a case note for each of the tutorial sessions, and then the tutors go over their work and provide anonymized feedback on each of the pieces. So having explained some of the basic structure of the course, let me turn to more practical tips and some of the, I think, useful lessons that I've learned in managing this kind of class. So what I found was quite useful was, first of all, to provide templates for this variety of legal forms. So to generate engagements, but also to give the students an example, very practical visual example of what these kind of legal writing forms look like. And of course, you know, that in a way it's the first step, and that's passive learning. It's the question of looking at someone else's work. The way that I use the templates, especially, let me go back to the point about the law reform essay competition here. So I picked 2 essay entries from 2 years ago. I've been using them for the past 2 years. I asked the students to read those 2 entries before and to mark them using our CUHK grading criteria. So in the class, I asked them to discuss in small groups what's the grade and discuss the criteria. Then I go over in class discussion. I explain what each of the criteria entail. So I go over the questions of structure, the technical concepts, the question of how to use legal evidence for an essay, the question of critical thought, and of course, the question of form through presentation. So the samples, they mark the samples and they usually make 2 discoveries. One, that they're meaner markers than I am. And I think, you know, I've eased with age. So that's usually a sigh of relief on the part of the students. They're actually harsher on average than I am. Then they also get to see things from my perspective, right? So I think it's quite important to get the students to think as markers as well. And I do something quite similar in my revision class when I pick 2 legal memos from each class in different classes of grades. I mark them anonymously, and then I have my Word file with track changes where basically I explain my reasoning using the marking criteria for the grade that I've assigned on the legal memo as well. And it's quite important. I usually ask them what grade you would have assigned, what are the things that tick you off. So, you know, they always laugh at my petty peeves in the legal memo. If they spell the client's name wrong, they incur into my ire, and so on. Questions of citation. So basically kind of bringing together everything that was taught in the class. For plain English writing, we've been using, since Noam was convening the class, the help of a specialist. So we work with George Nichols. He does 2 sessions for the students. They're absolutely brilliant. So I think, you know, I don't have that level of specialism, but it's great to have someone who was a practicing lawyer first in the UK and then in Hong Kong to be able to do that for the students. And as I said, tutors offer individual feedback. Of course, you know, the question in a course like that to student-staff ratio remains hugely problematic. So this is, in a way, take it as mitigation. The optimal result, of course, would be to have very small continuous classes, but one has to strike a balance between available resources and pedagogy. We spend a little bit of time looking at the most common mistakes. And I do this, I think, in my 4th class with the students, and then I go back to these slides over and over in terms of feedback. So I think students just don't believe me at the beginning when I say the most common mistakes that I've seen in my teaching career is that essays, legal memos, not answering the questions. So when we're looking at so I spend a lot of time asking them to read the question, to paraphrase it, and basically to come up with an argument. So we do that with both the legal essay exercise, is the idea, so what's your argument? And it's even more striking when we do the legal memo. So the students are required to provide legal advice. And I always say, front load your advice. You know, everyone's busy. No one has got a lot of time to go and sift through a legal memo. It's your work product for a client, ultimately. So the legal advice has to be very clear. It has to be correct. It has to be clearly presented, and so on. And then that really, the point is brought home when we do the marking and when I show some of the samples. That's also that links directly to the second point, that the essay reads like a murder mystery. And I always say to them, you know, don't try to be Agatha Christie. It's a law essay. I'm a boring person. I don't like surprises. Don't shock me. From the first paragraph, I need to know where you're going with this. So that's usually the point. And I was like, don't make me dig for things. I am busy. I'm marking 200 essays, 200 legal memos. And then there is the third point, which is how, and that's really bringing together legal research, legal analysis, and legal writing. Sometimes you have an argument, but the argument is not backed up. So that becomes a point about what kind of use and what kind of analysis of the legal evidence, the legal material the students put forward. So how do we write about this? And that I try to tackle a lot, especially with case law analysis. Not always easy. And that kind of concludes my thoughts on this. I look forward to your comments.
So, thank you very much, Mara. We'll go straight over now to Professor Stephen Gallagher. So Steve's a professional consultant and professor of practice in law here at CUHK Law, and he's also Associate Dean Academic and Student Affairs. He's a member of the editorial committee of the Hong Kong Lawyer and author of Equity and Trust in Hong Kong, published by Street and Maxwell. So over to you, Steve.
Thank you very much, Michael. And thank you, Mara, as well, for sharing before. So I just wanted to talk to you about the voluntary written assessment that I've been using since I arrived in Hong Kong and began teaching principles of equity and trusts. I thought I'd just explain why I use it, how I use it, the feedback that I give, and the feedback that I get actually on this voluntary essay, and the development of it that's gone on in that time. So first of all, why? The main reason is, of course, that when I arrived in 2009, we didn't have Mara's course. So we didn't have Mara teaching the students about legal writing. And when I arrived, I'm not a great fan of exams. I really don't see that the standard form traditional exam is very useful in assessing whether our students have actually developed the skills that they're meant to develop on our courses or our programs. So I would rather use other forms of assessment. And I've always enjoyed research essays. I like to set the students a research essay. But there are problems. The two main ones, the one that everyone raises to me, aren't you worried about students cheating? We'll come back to that later on. But the most important one, I think, is I was a bit worried because when I put this forward, I was already hearing from the students when I arrived back in 2009 that many of them were telling me they had received no feedback on any written assignment by the time they reached my course. So they'd previously been doing mostly exams as their assessments, but even if they hadn't, they would have a final essay, and they really didn't get much feedback on it at the time. Things have changed, but that was what was at the time. So I just used this voluntary assignment. They answer it in the form of a written answer. This is to get them ready for a research essay, but it's actually a problem question. I'll explain why I use that a little bit later on. Here it is. Yeah, to most of you, I'm sure you're all familiar with equity and trust, and you enjoyed that when you were studying your law. So I'm sure you're all thinking, wow, this is very straightforward. But of course, the students receive this at the beginning of their study in equity and trust. So I put this forward. It is a voluntary assignment. I try to emphasize that as much as possible. And they have to write their answer, submit it by email to me in a Word document by a deadline. Originally, I had a word limit. In recent years, I've relaxed that, but I used to have a word limit of 1,000 words. And then, of course, they could have a bibliography as well, because I wanted them to practice actually referencing and using a bibliography because of the written essay component of the course as well. So, as I said, they submit as a Word document. That's important because then when I look at this, I can use track changes to actually put comments and feedback in. There is a research element to this, even though it is a problem question, because these are topics they have not covered in class. So this is at the early stages of the course. They haven't covered the things they have to cover in answering these problem questions as well. So this does involve them doing some research in reading ahead, which of course has benefits as well. But it's not just looking at the law. I'm also looking at their written English skills as well. Their sort of written presentation skills and their English skills. So in the track changes, I will actually comment on their English and their use in developing points as well in their written styles. The referencing for the real essay, I think, is an important thing, particularly because we have some issues with referencing styles that are recommended. I think Mara's raised this before about our own in-house referencing and everything else. And our students are coming from different backgrounds on the JD. This is a JD course. So some of them will have come from disciplines where they have been using in-text referencing. We're now trying to ask them to use a sort of an Oxford style footnoting system, which is what I expect them to use in my essay. So again, it's to try and give them some experience in using this as well. So it's useful for the real essay. Also, because they are starting to answer problem questions, it's also useful, I think, for the exam when they come to, because the exam, because they do an essay component earlier, the exam is all problem questions. Mara said that she's already introduced them to the IREC system. I know that other colleagues have already been teaching them on other courses and have been using the IREC system with us as well. I always tell them that they're free to use any system they like in actually answering these questions for me in the written answer. I return all the essays to them with feedback before they begin their real essays. So that's my commitment to them. Every year I regret making this commitment to them, but that is the commitment I make and say, if you can get those essays in, I will return them to you with feedback when you are, well, at least when you're beginning your real essays. And I post a suggested answer, my suggested answer, up with a bibliography, a rough bibliography, a table of cases or whatever else, just to give them a sort of an idea again of format for the real essay as well. I think this is useful because, of course, a lot of the students start to panic. When I say something is voluntary, a lot of them then send me emails saying, do we have to do this? And I have to say, no, it's voluntary. But of course, then they panic and think, well, if we don't do it, we're missing out. And I say, well, yes, I think you are missing out because you're missing out on the feedback. But don't worry, I will post a suggested answer. So at least you do get to see what sort of thing I was looking for as well. And apart from that, we have an in-class run through it as well. So I take some time in one of the seminars to run through the questions. I break them down into a PowerPoint. We then annotate that. We used to use the interactive whiteboard. Today we'd use the online systems because we're online teaching at present. But these are, I think, that a very useful exercise, even for those people who haven't done it. Well, maybe particularly for those people who haven't done it, and for those who have done it as well. I take that point to actually highlight, flag up some of the common mistakes. So I thought that was nice when Mara was talking about common mistakes. I was thinking there are things that come up, emphasizing some practical tips, both for their essays and also later for the exam as well. So one of the common things is here, that first statement, Peter died recently, leaving the following dispositions in his validly executed will. Every time, and I haven't started marking this year's voluntary assignments, but I'm sure there will be a couple of students who have submitted answers where they will have spent a long time explaining to me what is required for a validly executed will. And of course, what they'll tell me will be correct. It will be correct as to the law, and it will be well explained and everything. And I have to try and explain to them, well, but it's irrelevant. You know, you're not going to lose marks for explaining this, but you're not gaining any marks because it says validly executed will, you don't need to do this. And it is, I'm hoping to sort of drive home those points again about reading questions and looking and actually thinking about what you're being asked to do. The student feedback I've generally had since the very beginning, back in 2009, is it's been very popular. And we usually get over half of the students. It tends to be about 200 students on the 3 courses, maybe 220 in some years, but I usually get well over half. Last year I had a lot more. And the most common comment I've had, whether it's been in face-to-face when students have come up and said, thank you for this, or at the end in my CTEs, is that they've never had this opportunity before. Now, I know we have got now courses where Mara and others are helping students and giving feedback, but I think this was an important point. A lot of our students had never had that opportunity to actually submit some written work and get feedback directly on that written work before. And that's obviously become, is very important to them. So that's the positives. The problems is it's very popular. And that means a lot of work in the marking of it. And as I said, every year I do, on Sunday was the deadline, and my inbox on the Monday morning, when I saw all of the emails, you know, you do think, okay, now I've got to sort of discipline myself to actually go through all of these. But that's a drawback. There is a bit more work to it as well. I was also worried at the beginning because I used the same problem. I've used the same problem for a number of years, that students might share the suggested answer that I'd given them with the following years, and the current students just answer on this basis. I did think at the time that would be, why would they do this? And luckily, I don't think I've ever found anyone doing that. I've had some really excellent answers over the years, which have just, you know, almost mirrored my sort of suggested answer. But I don't think they've really been as silly really to do something like this. So I think it's been very popular. Recent developments, and a few years ago, I started to suggest that if students were worried that they didn't have the time themselves to actually produce an answer on their own, that they could work as a group. And I actually thought that would be a really useful exercise as well, that they could then get together and discuss or break it down and say, you know, you answer the first bit, you answer the second bit, or whatever else, and then get together and work on this. I thought that could be quite useful for them in their learning as well. As I said, last year it was very popular. This year, I don't think I'm up to those numbers, but I know it's well over the 100 that have been submitted. And again, I think that shows it's very popular. As I said, the emphasis I always make to them is that it is a voluntary assessment. And the other thing I always stress to them as well is it doesn't matter if they submit part of the assessment. If they haven't got time to do everything, I'll take part answers and I'll give them feedback on that. The other thing is, it doesn't matter if they get everything wrong, because actually that's really good, because then I give them feedback on why it's wrong, and hopefully that allows them to then ask more to try and correct the fact that they haven't understood things, or they're not getting the right way to answer things, or whatever else. The future developments, well, I think all of us have been, you know, inundated over the years with things from educationalists, and the university here, it keeps on emphasizing that we should vary assessment as much as possible to assess all these different skills. And of course, there are debates each year about people changing assessment formats or developing new courses with new assessment formats as well. But I think the problem we've had in recent years is, of course, that there's been pressure on us in some ways to make assessment simpler, more administratively than I think in content. And so there has been a move again, I think, to more and more exams. I know that when we reviewed this a couple of years ago with colleagues, well, I was surprised with how many different forms of assessment the colleagues are using, but I still think there's been pressure. We've had pressure in Hong Kong when we had our double cohort students coming through a few years ago, that obviously their colleagues are seeing more workload, and in some ways having a final exam is easier than setting coursework, midterms, that sort of thing as well. The other thing is that continued obsession in the academic world with plagiarism and dishonesty. I've had this issue a number of times when people say, how can you give them an essay? You know, aren't you worried that the students will cheat? Well, not really. I'm afraid I tend to trust the students in this. We have our system, which is meant to flag up if there are issues. There have been occasions when I have caught students who have been, who have not referenced, who have plagiarized, but I do worry that everyone is so focused on this that it's actually leading to us not using forms of assessment like research essays and other things. The voluntary essay is definitely of value for me. I think it helps the students to get ready for their research coursework and even for the end of term exam as well that they have to do, because this is a compulsory subject, so they have to have a 50% exam component. And as I said, I think the student feedback continues to support this. I have thought about using it in other courses I teach. I don't so far. That is at times because I'm teaching with other colleagues as well, and we have to work out between us how we want to do things and how we want to assess things. And I think that's an important thing when you are sharing teachers with others. But anyway, that's just my observations on the use of a voluntary assessment in equity and trusts on the JD. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. So that was great, and we'll come back to questions at the end. And so the final thing is, I'll try to share my slides. Okay, so I hope you can see these slides. So these are my thoughts about developing student writing skills, and I'm Michael Lowe. Here's this, first of all, to say, I think you'll see there's a lot of overlap with what Mara and Steve have already said in terms of, you know, why are we doing this? So I'm going to talk about that, and also in terms of like practical tips. I think there's a lot of overlap between the three of us. So I'm going to talk about why I think it's important, what kinds of writing we can encourage, and what our role is as teachers. I think this overlaps with Mara's practical tips and some of the points that Steve made. And then I've just got a little list of different ways in which in my own teaching practice I've tried to encourage students to get writing. Part of the support I think we've got to offer to students is that we've got to model it. So I'll talk about how we can model it. And then publishability, whereas it's not a requirement that student work should be publishable at this level, it is a legitimate aspiration. I think we should be encouraged to do so. I'll talk about that briefly. But I'll also say that, as this afternoon has already shown, is there are lots of different ideas about how we can encourage student writing. So I hope this will just be the beginning, and that other people want to also share their ideas, either today in the Q&A or by giving a presentation themselves later. So why is it important? And like Mara, I think that breaks down into two components. First of all, we're in higher education, we're in the university. So we want students to be able to articulate what they think, you know, to make it available to others. You know, so say, this is what I think. What do you think about that? So, and also as part of that, to engage in critical comment. So to do that, they can do that orally, but of course, within higher education, within the university, they also need to be able to do that in the written forms that are used within the university. So partly it's a question of inducting students into the ways of the university and the ways of higher education. But then the third bullet point, it's also, so Mara talked about, you know, words are what we do as lawyers. So what are we trying to do in legal education? We can say we want students to learn to think like lawyers, but an important part of that is they should be able to write like lawyers. This is an important part of the craft of lawyering. What kinds of writing can we get students to do? And I think, you know, we can get them to write down their answers to tutorial questions. So I'll come back to that later. We can get them to think about their answers to exam questions as something that should be well written. Of course, and then there's traditional kind of academic forms of literacy, so teaching them how to write research courseworks. But then also we can think about more kind of 21st century forms of literacy. So talking to students about, you know, what are the qualities of a good blog post? getting them to write blog posts, perhaps engaging in kind of forms of journalism as well. So kind of a variety of genre that we can introduce. But kind of my key thought, and I think really the point of this afternoon really is to say that we as teachers are central in terms of supporting the development of student writing skills. And so this is the package of the sort of things that we need to do. And as I say, I think this really overlaps with what Mara and Steve have said already. So we need to give students plenty of opportunities to write and encourage them to write. For each type of writing they're going to do, tutorial questions, exam questions, courseworks, blog posts, we need to explain what the elements are of a good type of good writing of that type. So feed forward. And then, as Mara talked about, to give examples of good writing, and ideally get students to critique those examples. The benefit of that is that by critiquing them, they're not just learning the elements of good writing really as kind of abstract propositions, but they see what they mean and come to see what they mean in practice, and they come to internalize them. I think we've got to be generous with our time, be available throughout the process to give advice to students. I think we need to model good writing practices of students, and I've got something to say about that later. And then as Steve has said, I think Mara said as well, to give feedback, not just a grade, so that we tell students what they did well, what they could improve on, so that they can take that forward to later writing opportunities. So then for a few slides, what I want to do now is just a little kind of selection of ways in which I try to encourage student writing. And the first examples are taken from my teaching of land law, which is a third-year undergraduate course. So in 2015-16, I introduced this exercise. I created a discussion forum within the course Blackboard site, and the requirement was that students had to contribute a 250-word post to that discussion forum, which would count for 5% of the overall mark, assessed on a pass-fail basis. So it's quite low stakes. As long as they submitted something, they would get 5%. But also the idea that it would relate to the law of the ownership of the family home. This deals with several themes within Land Law 1. So, I hoped that this would be an opportunity for them to think carefully and critically and write carefully and make that available to other students in the discussion forum. The lessons I learned from doing this are really the things I said already, that this will only work if we support it properly. So you need to give students a model of what a good discussion forum contribution looks like. You need to explain the criteria and give them a model of a posting, and be present in the forum, to keep things moving and give feedback there and then on the posts. Otherwise, this can kind of die the death. So that's one possibility. But then for 3 years after that, I did something slightly different. I got students to write, instead of that discussion forum, to write a 500-word essay or blog post. Actually, in the first year, they could also produce videos and podcasts, and some of them did that. That counted for 10% of the overall Land Law 1 mark, again, pass-fail basis, so low risk, low stakes, again, about the law of the ownership of the family home. Now, one innovation here was that students could work individually, or they could work in small groups of 2 or 3, an idea Steve kind of mentioned a moment ago. And after 3 years of doing this, about 90% of the students were working in small groups. And one of the big things I learned is that students value this ability to work in small groups. What I found was that they were teaching each other, correcting each other's misunderstandings, and also that it made learning a pleasanter, more social experience. And I also said that they could use these blog posts. I did create a blog, in fact, 2 blogs to which they could post as well, that they could use this blog post as the basis of their individual research courseworks, because that counted for 10%, but another 30% was a 1,250-word research coursework where they had to have a research question on any topic related to the Land Law 1 syllabus, which could build on the blog post they'd done for the 10%. So it could relate to the law of the ownership of the family home. Now on this, I just wanted to talk about the types of support I offered. So first of all, I had a lecture where I explained the feedback, I explained the kind of performance criteria, what would make for a good coursework, using a feedback sheet I'm going to show you in the next slide. I also, and this was time consuming, made myself available to discuss things with students. So either in class or outside of class, so they could come and see me and say, well, I was thinking about this research question. And so we could talk about the research questions, how they could structure the answer, the materials they could use. And then, well, after they'd submitted, I gave individual written feedback using this feedback sheet. Now, I'm not going to go through this with you, but if you'd like it, feel free to email me. I'm going to put my email address at the end, and I'm happy to send it to you. But I found this a really useful tool. Like many of you, over the years, I've assessed hundreds or thousands of dissertations, courseworks of various types. And so kind of reflecting on what made for a good dissertational coursework. And then I tried to kind of encapsulate those reflections in this sheet. And then I use this to explain that to students in advance. And then this was the feedback sheet I used later to give them feedback. Now I drew on some of those earlier kind of initiatives I've just described, but when I created an entire course that was really focused on student writing, issues in property law. So in this elective for third and fourth year students, all of whom had already had those experiences of Land Law 1. So in a way, they've been inducted into this through Land Law 1. The students worked for 8 weeks in groups of 3 to 5 self-selected groups on a presentation and a blog post on any research question they chose, which related to property law, broadly conceived. Then in week 8, let me just say, we recruited research postgraduate students to act as facilitators, recruited and trained them. And what those facilitators were able to do was, for instance, to listen to the rehearsal of the presentation and give feedback, to read the blog post and give feedback. So that was a really, really useful thing. So in week 8, we had a conference where the student groups gave their presentations. And then I gave feedback on that, written feedback. And then later in the week, they submitted the blog post about based on the presentation. So together, that counted for 40% of the overall mark. And then 60% was an individual research coursework, where they could again build on that blog post they'd done already. Some people did, and some people didn't. I want to talk about this idea of support, of supporting students through the process, particularly with regard to the blog post. So I prepared a tweaked version of that feedback sheet, amended, to reflect on, well, what are the qualities of a good blog post rather than a good research coursework? And so they're slightly different. So I used that to explain that to the criteria to students. Then I downloaded 3 blog posts about legal issues from the Australian version of the conversation. And I got the students working in their groups to read those blog posts and to evaluate them, to say, well, how do they satisfy those criteria? So as I say, that's an attempt to help students to understand and internalize these criteria, these qualities of a good blog post. So that's all I want to say about that. I do think as well that we can use tutorial questions, really, as Steve and Mara have said already, and the linked thing of exam questions, preparing for exams. That's a valuable opportunity to help students to write. So in land law, we have, as the common pattern, we have a lecture for the whole group, and then a week later, students then given a tutorial sheet with problem questions based on that material, and they come to a tutorial to discuss those questions. The good thing about that type of question, like the questions Steve showed before, is that they often are like about advising clients. So they've got that element of authenticity that's what students think they're getting ready to do, advise clients. So I think that kind of engages them. So I explained to students the criteria for a good answer, drawing on the faculty grade descriptors. And those criteria emphasize the need for clear and well-presented writing and for well-structured, well-presented critical reflection. And then I say to the students that I encourage them to write down those answers before the tutorial and then come to the tutorial with those written answers. The students have a few minutes before the tutorial, within the tutorial, to present to each other. And that's an opportunity to get feedback. And then I'll ask one of the students to read their answer out, and then if necessary to give feedback on what they say. So and then they can refine their written answers. So that what happens then is the students are preparing a portfolio of writing as they go through the course. And trying to improve that writing as they go through the course. And then, of course, that's a great resource for the exam itself. Giving them templates has been mentioned already. And so, yes, I think, so I write down a model answer so that students can see what the criteria look like on the page, so to speak. I make myself available for discussion inside the class and outside the class, and encourage them to talk to each other about this writing inside the class and outside the class. Finally, I think the individual research coursework that they do in the 4th year. So they've got to do a long research project. And I think that's a wonderful opportunity to encourage and develop writing skills. So we don't act as supervisors, we just act as assessors, but we've got this 1-hour initial consultation in which we help them to frame a research question and think about the structure of the overall essay and the materials they're going to draw on. But I've also prepared a guidance document, 4 or 5 pages, that I give them in advance with what I think are the most important general criteria for a good coursework. But also that feedback sheet I mentioned earlier, having had a general oral discussion about the research question and its structure and so on, I then get that feedback sheet out and then take them through it and say, well, okay, how is your project going to map onto this feedback sheet? And I think students find that a helpful way to kind of get a handle on what they're going to do next. One year, I organized a conference and got a little group of students I was assessing to present to each other. I haven't done that again, but I do encourage students as a way of preparing to write. I encourage them to talk to other people about their project. So I do think that speaking and writing kind of go together. We can give both opportunities. At the beginning, at the end of that initial consultation, I say to the students that a week or 2 before submission, just when they've got an advanced draft, that they can send it to me. And then I won't read it in detail, but I'll spend 10 minutes to see if there's any obvious feedback I can give them, kind of formative feedback before they submit. And all students do that. And as I say, I do think we should encourage students to aspire to publish, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. How can we model writing for students? That's one of the ways in which we support student writing. So by posting model answers, and by our own writing, whether it be blog posts, peer-reviewed journal articles, legal journalism, so students benefit from seeing our writing, specifically you, the teacher who is teaching them. But also in a way, the kind of ongoing editorial support we give them, and kind of apprenticeship we put them through with that feed forward, being available for discussion and feedback. So publishability, not a criterion at undergraduate level, but in fact, students often do publish. It's a legitimate aspiration for them. So we've got lots of students who publish blog posts, short articles of the more journalistic kind, or even they've published in peer-reviewed journals. So, and so we should encourage students to aim for that, even though it's not a criterion. I'm not going to go through this again, but this is my version of Mara's practical tips, and I've talked about it already. But my point is this, that we've all got our own version of that. And what I think we need is a lot more of this, sharing of ideas and experiences, because there's more than one way to go about this, more than one way to think about this task. So I hope we will do this again. And if anybody wants any of my stuff, this is my email address. So that's it. So let's see. So just had a hi from Angela Daly, who's been joining us from, I think, from Aberdeen now. So that's great. Nice to see you, Angela. And then a question from Antonio Maria da Rosa. Hi all. First, many thanks to the three professors for their presentations. I have two questions. First, given the stop-start nature of the academic semesters, how do you get students to improve their writing on a continuing basis? Perhaps I'll stop there. I'll put the second question, but what do you both think about the first? How do we give students the opportunity to improve writing on a continuing basis?
Mara, do you want to take that one, or shall I?
Sure. Well, one of the things I've been doing, I've asked students, well, I've advertised some of the essay reform competitions as a way of getting both practice and CV enhancement. I've offered over the years the opportunity to students to report on some of the events, and then I help with editing for the Student Gazette. I always encourage them to look for to write blog posts on something they're interested in, so kind of suggest to look out for them. But I think, beyond encouraging and offering a little bit of advice, there's also a question of very limited capability. I mean, in my case, I have over 200 students, and I'm sure you do as well. So together with research commitments, so it's squaring those balances.
Thanks, Mara. Steve, anything you want to say?
Well, I mean, the same problems as Mara says. We're dealing with quite a lot of students at times, so that's the issue. But it is a good point about that. The amount of time that our students spend with us, the breaks they have, there could be ways that they could use that to improve their written skills. I know that some of the students will start talking to me maybe I don't know, I see them in the second term of the first year if they're full-time JD students, and they'll start talking to me about the fact that they may want to do an independent research essay in the following year. And if they do, I always try to say to them, you should start thinking about your research and perhaps even starting to think about running up plans and everything before that. So I think that gives them a longer time to actually think about writing and developing things to do with their writing over that time. But it is a problem, particularly on these on the JD, which is a very compressed and very high pressure course for them. They do have a start-stop, but they also have a lot of pressure on them to get everything done. I don't know, Michael, have you thought about this?
Well, yes. What I just add into that is that idea of getting students to think of writing as really a key, as a key component of their learning, to write down answers to all the problems that they face in class. So I think that's a message that needs to be given and then reinforced, that they should be writing all the time, instead of perhaps thinking, well, I've got to listen, underline, but write, to engage actively by writing. So that would be my tip. There's a second part to Antonio's question, and what do you do personally to continuously improve your own writing? And is there some application for students? So maybe we do the same, Mara, Steve. What do you personally do to continuously improve your own writing? And is there some application for students?
Thanks, Antonio. That's a fantastic question. It's a steep, hard road. I have to say that the sessions that George Nichols does for us in the JD class on plain English writing are incredibly beneficial. And I've been doing them 3 times a week for 3 years, and I still find them incredibly useful. I think everyone could do with a bit of plain English writing in terms of editing and so on. I think it's what Michael was saying. It's a lot of practice continuing and so on, and variety also writing styles, right? So I think for me it's been a combination of journal articles, blog posts recently quite a lot, legal advice in some cases. So I've been doing some work on some constitutional arguments for a case that is ongoing. Engagement with the media. I think it's really the mixed bag. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's it. We have to just keep on writing ourselves, don't we? And we do, hopefully, in a number of different ways, as Mara said. But of course, the other thing is to keep on reading. I suppose just keep on reading lots of different things, not just, you know, we read legal reports, we read judgments, we read legal articles, but we should read other things as well. I think it's very nice to read very good English writers at times who have, well, anyway, styles that I admire. I'm not sure everyone does. I know Mick Fisher and I both like John le Carre, but I'm not sure his style, his mastery of colons and semicolons probably wouldn't go down too well in the legal world. But yeah, it's reading lots of things are different as well. I think that's something I do. Michael, what do you do?
Well, again, I think so that idea of personally doing different types of writing across genre. Well, one thing I just thought I'd like to emphasize is blogging is one option. So, and that's got double relevance to today. So I have created a property law blog, a public facing blog, and I've written on it, but a number of my students have also contributed to that. So blogging personally, but then also getting students to blog apart from scholarly writing in journals. So I would say that's what I'd say about that. Yeah, so thanks for those questions, Antonio. Then Shishwe, who says, thanks for the great seminar. My questions for all the speakers. My courses have both JDs and LLMs. I noticed that JD students have a legal writing course. Do LLM students have a similar course? So if not, and maybe the answer is no, if not, does the faculty, oh, Mara.
They do not, but I got actually some LLM students who were really quite keen. I had one student that was really keen, got on the waiting list and eventually managed to join the class. So I think they're increasingly recognizing the value of acquiring those skills. So I'm getting every year more requests.
Great.
But the course is just too big already.
Sorry, can I just come in here because Christopher, sorry, Christopher, I don't know your surname, but you've sent in this point, which I think is a really important one. Christopher said, all of this assumes excellent English in the first place. I coach non-native English speakers on legal writing and presentation skills. A big problem is that many law students and young lawyers do not have excellent English. This has a significant impact on their understanding of what they hear and read, and of course on their careers. Do participants feel that they would welcome specialist courses on written and spoken English? I know that our undergraduate students do have specialist courses, but I don't think our postgraduate students, I think they have access through the university to some voluntary courses they can sign up for, but at present, I don't think they do. My own feeling is in teaching our students on the JD and the LLMs that yes, there are some of the non-native speakers who struggle because of the problems they have with the English. We have some non-native English speakers who, of course, their English is wonderful and much better than mine could ever be as a native English speaker, especially from London. But there are definitely some who struggle, and it is sometimes, you know, when I do this voluntary assignment, I have had to say to only a handful of students at times, you've got real problems with your English. And I'm thinking, I don't even know if you've got enough time to get any help now, because you're already here on a law course, but you're struggling really to actually write lucid English sentences or paragraphs. It's really, you know, a handful where it has been that much of a problem. And I've tried to talk to them and I've tried to sort of help, but it really worries me at that point. So I don't think it's a general problem, but I think it's something that we could think about. I don't know if anyone else has got a comment on that.
No, but there was another part of that question from Shishwe, and what that was, if there's no course, are there any books that we would recommend for self-study about legal writing?
I usually recommend this book, Brian Garner, Writing in Plain English. It's got exercises. It's mostly for American law schools, but it does the trick. I think a lot of the material is what George Nichols covers in my course. So perhaps it might be worth having George to do a session for the LLMs as well, an extra session. I don't know, Steve, you know.
Not too sure about that, but I mean, again, I've been asked at times to recommend, and I've recommended a number of those sort of plain English style books, particularly for the legal writing side of it. And that's all. I don't know if I can bring this in as well. Mick Fisher.
Can I just say something before?
Sure. Sorry, Michael. Yeah.
Jeannie Lai, our Associate Dean for Teaching and Learning, has said on writing competitions, can I just mention that there's a new writing competition initiative for all our CUHK Law students this year. The 2022 Professional Ethics Student Essay Competition is open to students who are enrolled in the CUHK LLB, JD, LLM, and PCLL programs in 2021-2022. It aims to promote awareness of professional ethics among CUHK Law students. Deadline, April 2022. Sorry, Steve, that's it.
No, sorry, that's very useful. But Mick Fisher has just raised this point of should we be supervisors rather than assessors. I think that's because I raised the issue of the independent research essays that our students do. And because they're independent research essays, we are usually termed to be assessors. We have a meeting with the students, we discuss what they're going to do, but then they're really left to themselves, their own devices. Michael, I think your experience has been that, you know, when you work with students on things, obviously their written work becomes much better. And of course, surely that's got to be an improving thing. So it is something we've looked at in the past, whether we should change the emphasis we have on our sort of dissertations that we get the students to do, that we should become more supervisors and give them more feedback and help them develop their writing as well. So I think that's possibly something that we might revisit.
All right, that's great, Steve. A landlord student has said, could we organise more writing competitions, academic conferences, to practice our writing skills? So that's something to ponder on. Can I just say, apart from competitions, I mean, there are things like the Property Law blog. There are other blogs. One of our colleagues, Professor Rian Abiratne, he gets his students to write for a constitutional law blog. So I don't know about competitions, but we certainly could try to find ways to publicize more opportunities to write for external audiences. Okay, I think we've probably come to the end of the time.